Deep within the silent cradle of the mountains, the rough camp began to dream of something greater than gold. It was a transformation etched in mud and timber, turning a chaotic settlement into the seat of a new empire.
The transformation of Bannack from a rough and chaotic collection of canvas tents into the first seat of political power in the Montana Territory was not a sudden event, but a slow and grinding evolution that took place against the backdrop of a wilderness that seemed determined to reclaim its own. The winter of 1863 had been brutal and unforgiving, with snowdrifts that buried the humble cabins to the rooflines and winds that howled down the canyon like a pack of starving wolves.
But as the earth finally tilted back towards the sun, the spring brought a violent thaw that turned the frozen ruts of the single main street into a quagmire of knee-deep mud that sucked at the boots of miners and clogged the wheels of the heavy freight wagons. The air was thick with the heavy scent of wet earth and pine resin and the rotting vegetation that had been trapped under the ice for months. It was a season of awakening, and with the mud came a new energy that pulsed through the valley. The miners, who had spent the long, dark months huddled around wood stoves, emerged with a renewed fever for gold, and they were joined by a new wave of humanity that poured over the mountain passes. The architecture of Bannack began to change as the temporary gave way to the permanent. The sound of the valley shifted from the simple splashing of water in sluice boxes to the rhythmic pounding of hammers and the rasping of saws that echoed off the canyon walls from dawn until dusk. Men were dragging logs of pine and fir from the surrounding hillsides, using teams of oxen that strained against their wooden yokes, with steam rising from their flanks in the cool morning air. These were not the hastily built shelters of the previous year, but substantial structures meant to last. They built false fronts on the buildings to make them look grander and taller than they actually were, which was a common trick of the western frontier to mimic the civilized cities of the east. The wood was raw and yellow and smelled of sap and hope. A main street began to take shape that ran parallel to the winding creek, and it became the artery through which the lifeblood of the town flowed. Merchants arrived in droves, bringing with them the trappings of civilization that had been so sorely missed in the early days of survival. A man could now walk into a store and buy a sack of fine white flour without trading his soul for it, and he could find bolts of colorful calico cloth and heavy woolen trousers, and even the occasional luxury, like tinned oysters from the coast or a bottle of fine brandy from France. The arrival of women and families marked the true turning point in the life of the town, because they brought with them a demand for order and decency that the rough miners had largely ignored. The rough edges of the mining camp began to soften as curtains appeared in the windows of the log cabins, and the smell of baking bread began to mingle with the scent of wood smoke and wet wool. Schools were established in drafty cabins where children learned to read from tattered books, while the sounds of drinking and gambling drifted in from the saloons next door. But a town of such rapid growth and immense wealth needed more than just supplies and shelter, because it needed law and it needed structure. The territory was vast and unruly, and at this time the region was technically part of the Idaho Territory, which was a sprawling administrative giant that was impossible to govern effectively from its capital across the treacherous Bitterroot Mountains. The miners of Bannack felt isolated and ignored and vulnerable. They were generating millions of dollars in gold dust, yet they had no voice in the government and no protection from the chaos that plagued the trails where road agents lay in wait. The cry for a new territory began to rise from the saloons and the meeting halls and the dinner tables. Prominent citizens and ambitious politicians saw an opportunity to carve a new destiny out of the mountains. Among them was Sidney Edgerton, who was a man of education and refinement who had been appointed as the Chief Justice for the Idaho Territory,
but who had found himself stranded in Bannack by the winter snows. Edgerton recognized the potential of the town, and he saw that the center of gravity had shifted. The gold was here, and the people were here, and the power should be here too. He knew that the only way to secure the future of Bannack was to separate it from Idaho and create a new political entity. He undertook a perilous journey all the way to Washington, D.C. to plead the case of the miners. He carried with him nuggets of Bannack gold, hidden in the lining of his coat, to show the politicians in the East the wealth that lay hidden in these valleys.
It was a journey fraught with danger, not only from the bandits on the road, but from the political turmoil of the Civil War that was consuming the capital. Yet his mission was successful. On May 26, in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed the act that created the Montana Territory. The news traveled slowly by telegraph and stagecoach across the plains, but when it finally reached Bannack, the celebration was raucous and filled with pride. The town was no longer just a mining camp in the middle of nowhere. It was now the capital of a territory that was larger than many nations in Europe. Sidney Edgerton returned not as a stranded traveler, but as the first territorial governor. The dust of the streets seemed to settle with a new gravity as the town prepared to take on the mantle of government.
The physical transformation of Bannack into a capital city was a study in contrasts that would seem absurd to anyone from the established cities of the East. The governor did not inhabit a stone palace with marble columns and manicured gardens. He lived in a large log house that was only slightly more impressive than the cabins of the miners. This building, which would become known as the governor's mansion, was the heart of the new government, and it sat right in the middle of the dust and the noise. It was here, in this rustic structure, that the future of the state was debated by men wearing muddy boots and smelling of tobacco smoke and whiskey. The main room of the mansion was a place of constant activity, where petitioners and office seekers and rough frontiersmen gathered to bend the ear of the governor. The furniture was simple and handmade from local pine, and the walls were decorated with maps of the territory and the skins of local animals like bear and elk. The business of government was conducted to the soundtrack of the mining camp, which included the braying of mules and the shouting of teamsters and the occasional gunshot from a dispute in the street. The winter of 1864 brought the first legislative session to Bannack, which was a historic moment that solidified the status of the town as the seat of power. The legislators, who had been elected from the various mining camps of the region, gathered in Bannack to write the laws that would govern the wild frontier. They did not meet in a grand Capitol building with a dome painted with frescoes. They met in two modest log buildings that were rented for the occasion and furnished with rough benches and tables. The conditions were primitive and harsh. The wind howled through the gaps in the logs, and the wood stoves had to be stoked constantly to keep the ink from freezing in the wells. Yet within these humble walls, the foundations of Montana law were laid by men who took their duty seriously. These men debated the location of roads and the regulation of mining claims and the punishment for crimes. They created the first civil and criminal codes for the territory, which became known as the Bannack Statutes. It was a surreal quality to the existence of Bannack during this time, because on one side of the street you had the machinery of government, with men in suits discussing statutes and decrees, while on the other side of the street you had the raw and violent energy of the gold rush. A legislator might spend his day debating the finer points of civil law, and his evening drinking whiskey in a saloon where the only law was the revolver. The town was a bizarre hybrid of civilization and savagery, where the lines between the two were often blurred. The streets were filled with a colorful cast of characters that could only exist in such a time and place. There were lawyers carrying leather satchels who walked alongside prospectors, leading mules laden with pickaxes and shovels. There were soldiers in blue uniforms who had come to protect the new government, and there were native people who watched the expansion of the white man with a quiet and justified wariness. The title of capital brought a temporary sophistication to Bannack that it had never known before. Social circles began to form around the governor's family and the wives of the legislators. There were dinner parties held in the log cabins where fine china was set upon rough wooden tables, and guests ate venison and drank champagne that had been hauled thousands of miles by wagon. The women of the town organized dances and literary societies, trying to recreate the culture they had left behind in the East, and for a brief moment, Bannack felt like it was the center of the world. It was the place where history was being made and where the future was being written. The arrival of the printing press was another major milestone in the maturation of the town. The Montana Post, which was the territory's first newspaper, began to publish the news of the world and the local gossip. The rhythmic clanking of the press was the heartbeat of the new capital, proving that they were no longer isolated from the rest of humanity. However, the glory of being the capital was destined to be fleeting, like the gold itself. Even as the legislators debated in their log cabins, the gold in the creeks of Bannack was beginning to thin, and the easy wealth that had drawn thousands to the valley was being exhausted. Meanwhile, a new strike in a nearby gulch had given birth to Virginia City, which was growing faster and richer than Bannack ever had. The population of Bannack began to drift away, chasing the next big strike, because loyalty in the West was always to the gold. The politicians, who were pragmatic men, began to realize that the seat of power needed to be where the people and the money were. The writing was on the wall for Bannack. It had served its purpose as the cradle of the territory. It had birthed the government, and it had established the rule of law, but it could not hold on to the crown. By the time the capital was officially moved to Virginia City, the golden age of Bannack was already fading into the twilight. The log buildings that had housed the governor and the legislature would eventually fall silent, standing as empty monuments to a time when this narrow valley was the most important place in the Northern Rockies. The story of Bannack as the capital is a story of ambition and resilience and the fleeting nature of power in the American West. It rose from the mud to become a seat of government and then slowly returned to the quiet dignity of a ghost town, leaving behind only the echoes of the gavel and the whisper of the wind through the pines. We have survived the perilous road to Bannack, but the true danger lies waiting within the town itself, a danger hiding behind a charming smile and a silver star. In our next chapter, we will uncover the chilling story of Sheriff Henry Plummer and the double life he led in the shadows. If this journey into the past helped you relax, please leave a like and subscribe to Drowsium. Your support helps us keep these old stories alive. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until then, close your eyes and let the silence of history guide your dreams. Good night.